Hello, and greetings from the Milan Church of Christ. My name is Dennis Swindle. I'm the minister with the Church of Christ here, and thank you for tuning in and listening and watching this video. And by the way, how are you doing, especially in light of everything that's going on in our country and world connected with the COVID-19 virus? I pray that you and yours are doing as well as possible. Well, this video is the first in a series of, I believe, very relevant Bible studies about an incident in the Old Testament that I call David's plague. David's plague. And not so much that this plague was from David, but he was the one that was responsible in an earthly sense for the plague coming upon the nation of Israel, which would cost Israel 70,000 people in 3 days or less. Well, we'll see more about that in just a few moments. Now, this series is going to consist of probably 5 lessons, maybe 6, very possibly 7, of about 25 minutes each in length. And someone may ask right up front, well, why spend 5 or 6 or maybe even 7 lessons on a story that barely covers 1 chapter of the Bible, albeit it is recorded in 2 different places in the Old Testament? 3 reasons. First of all, because I'm hoping to unearth some details about this incident that are easily overlooked by those who more casually peruse the biblical accounts. Number 2, we're going to investigate several apparent discrepancies between the 2 accounts. Some skeptics have used these discrepancies as a reason to say that the Bible is unreliable. So we're going to investigate that and see if that is correct, if there's any actual contradictions there. And number 3, I hope to reveal a substantial number of applications that'll apply to our world today, certainly the United States of America, and the lives of many of us who are Christians living today. But I assure you, this will be a worthwhile study, and I hope that you'll stay with us. I think it will be of great benefit to you, and I know it will be to me. So let's get started with David's plague. If you have a Bible nearby, I hope that you do. We have so many in this country. And turn to the Old Testament book of 1 Chronicles. 1 Chronicles, and you're going to go to chapter 21. 1 Chronicles, I'll give you a few moments. And by the way, the parallel account of the same story is found in 2 Samuel 24. Now, we're not going to turn there now, although from time to time we will make reference to what is recorded in the book of 2 Samuel. Now, before we actually begin reading in 1 Chronicles 21, let me just preface that by defining, first of all, the word plague, which we need to understand, especially since this series is entitled David's Plague. Okay, a plague typically is a highly infectious disease that poses a serious health hazard or risk to the general population and is often characterized by a higher than average mortality rate. Now, mortality rate is the percentage of those who are infected with the virus or bacteria and expire or die from it. And typically, a high mortality rate is any rate of 1% or better. Now, that's one definition, but let me give you a definition that I'm going to use in this series. A plague is a widespread or pervasive illness, affliction, or calamity that can be regarded as a warning or punishment from God. Now, David's plague was just that. And although only God can say for certain, I personally believe that the COVID-19 virus may be something that God has allowed to help teach or provide a warning, or perhaps even a punishment to our world and even our nation. So only God knows for sure. But obviously I can't think of a more appropriate time to talk about the subject of a plague due to the the frightening spread and the appalling effects of the coronavirus, COVID-19. As of this date that I'm making this video, this is April 3rd of 2020, there have been 1,200,000 confirmed cases of the virus worldwide since the outbreak all the way back in December of last year in Wuhan, China. There are right now some 765,000 active cases, that is those who currently are infected, of which we are aware. However, the actual number that are infected may be double or even triple that. There may be 2 million or more currently infected that just haven't all been tested, obviously. Very sadly, the United States leads the world in total cases, about 250,000 of Americans right now infected. Nearly, or who have been infected, nearly 6,500 Americans have died. As you have heard from various medical specialists and authorities, that number may not just swell but explode to one day over 100,000 or more may end up dying just in the United States alone. And I certainly don't have to tell you about the countless number of restrictions, closures, cancellations. In fact, our family, just a few days ago, canceled our family reunion that we've held annually for, several decades now. And we're canceling that and that wasn't even scheduled until midsummer, but with all the uncertainty surrounding the COVID-19 virus, we just felt it'd be better to cancel it for this year. And that's not to mention the social distancing and the sheltering in place or sheltering at home orders. And our hearts go out to and our prayers go to the throne of God about all the hospitals, the staffs, the doctors, the nurses, the ICU personnel, the emergency room personnel who are on the front lines of this war. And they are being overwhelmed. And sadly, this may get much worse before it gets better. Now, by the help of God, we pray that one day this will become much better, and we'll get on top of this, and one day we'll be through with all this. But I have a feeling that our nation, maybe our world, will never quite be the same again. We'll have to see. I hope if God has some lessons for us to learn, and I'm convinced He does, my opinion, I hope we'll learn those lessons. And one other thing before we get into 1 Chronicles 21, did you know that as horrendous as the COVID-19 virus is, and again, I don't think we've seen near the worst of it, it will probably just barely make the top 25 worst viruses or plagues, in recorded history. That's hard to believe. It will probably be very similar to the flu pandemic that occurred back in 1968. Some of you are old enough to remember that. I was in, 8th, 9th grade at the time, where they called it the Hong Kong flu. Killed over 1 million people worldwide, including 15% of the population of Hong Kong were killed by that. And there's approximately 12, maybe 15 other pandemics on record that have killed about 1 million people worldwide. And most likely the COVID-19 virus will make that sad category in terms of numbers. But that's just the lowest on the extreme end. The Asian flu, going back just a few years after I was born, in the late 50s, took the lives of probably 2 million or more worldwide. But then we get to the plague of Justinian. The plague of Justinian. Now that occurred, 15 centuries ago, 541 to 542. The first recorded instance of the bubonic plague killed 25 million worldwide, and about half the population of all of Europe at the time. Wow. And then going back to 1918, the flu pandemic infected over a third of the world's populace and killed an estimated 40 to 50 million people. But even that barely compares with the Black Death, the plague of 1346 to 1353, the bubonic plague that killed as many as 200 million people. And at that time in the history of the world, that was a large, large percentage of the world's population. And don't forget that since 1981, 36 million people have been killed by HIV/AIDS virus. And one other thing let me bring up while we're on the subject of plagues. Do you remember the 10th plague that God brought upon the Egyptians? The 10th and final plague, when he was trying to convince Pharaoh to let God's people go so eventually they could be freed from their captivity in Egypt and head for the promised land. Do you remember that last plague? It was the death of the firstborn males of all in Egypt and their animals as well. We're not given a precise number as to how many died, but many believe it was at least 100,000. Now, of course, that number would be small in comparison with these plagues I've mentioned previously. However, what really makes that plague distinct, and maybe a record, as it were, was the fact that those 100,000 people, or whether that was 80 or 100 or 150,000, they died in 8 hours or less. They died overnight, in one night. And I don't think anything this world has ever experienced is quite comparable to that. Although David's plague that we're going to talk about, again, it killed 70,000 Israelites in 3 days or less. So that comes fairly close. All right, let's get into our reading now. 1 Chronicles chapter 21. I'm just going to read the first 8 verses. There's more to come after this, but this will get us started. Now Satan stood up against Israel and moved David, that is, he enticed King David, to number Israel. In other words, take a census. And this census would mostly be concerning the fighting men, the soldiers, David's armies, as it were. And this was not a good thing. Now, we'll see why a little later on in another lesson, but let's continue. So David said to Joab, that was the commander of his armies, and to the leaders of the people, "Go number Israel from Beersheba to Dan, from across the entire nation, and bring the number of them to me that I may know it." That gives you a little hint as far as why this was so wrong, so sinful, because this was not something God commanded, because God had commanded previous numberings of the people. No, this is all David's idea. Well, it was the devil's idea. But no, David wanted to know just for himself. We'll talk more about that later, all right? And Joab answered. And listen, Joab was a good man in a lot of respects, a very courageous man. He had some flaws, but in this instance, this man just was a bright light for righteousness. Okay, but Joab answered, "May the Lord make his people 100 times more than they are." In other words, why is this number important? God may increase you 100 times more in terms of your people, your soldiers. "But my lord the king, are they not all my lord's servants? Don't they all belong to you? Why is it so important to number them? They're all loyal to you, David. Why then does my lord require this thing? And why should he, King David, be a cause of guilt in Israel?" In other words, David, don't you understand? If we do this thing, you're going to be the one to accept the blame. The buck's going to stop with you, and it's not going to be good. Nevertheless, the king's word prevailed against Joab. David just would not be dissuaded. He just set his mind on this thing. Have you ever done that before? Oh, I could tell you stories about me where I just had something in my mind and I knew it was either wrong or at best questionable, but I was so insistent I just had to have my way. Not a good thing, not a good thing. Okay, we continue. So Joab couldn't change his mind. Therefore Joab departed, and he was not happy, and went throughout all Israel and came to Jerusalem. So he finishes up the counting, almost, as we'll see. Then Joab gave the sum of the number to the people to David. And Joab was not at all happy about this. He was just forlorn. I think he was very depressed, as we would say. Well, here was the report. All Israel had 1,100,000 men who drew the sword. And Judah, there was somewhat of a division, not major at this time, had 470,000 men who drew the sword. So basically he says, David, okay, you've got about 1.5 million soldiers in your army. But notice this, verse 6, fascinating. But he did not count Levi and Benjamin among them, for the king's word was abominable to Joab. Joab hated every moment of taking this numbering, this census. And so he got to a certain point and he just said, enough. I'm not going any farther. I just cannot do that. I know God is displeased with this. This is wrong. This is wrong. This is wrong. I'm not going to cooperate any further. I hope we would all be like Joab in that regard. But we just say, no, I'm not going to do this any longer. So he didn't count all. He just got to the point. He said, this is it. And if David doesn't accept the number, I'll accept the consequence myself. Verse 7, and God was displeased with this thing. Therefore, he punished Israel. Now, God wasn't displeased with Joab. He was pleased with Joab. He was displeased with David and what David had decided to do. And David learned of this. Verse 8, so David said to God, I've sinned greatly because I've done this thing. But now, I pray, take away the iniquity of your servant. For I've done very foolishly, to say the least. Now you have to give David credit. And we'll talk more about this when we get to this verse in our verse-by-verse reading, but at least he was penitent. At least he was sorry. As they would say, though, too late. Too late. And although there's much more to come after this, let's go ahead and backtrack to verse 1, and I only have a few minutes left. Verse 1 really introduces the first of several enigmas about this story. An enigma, as most of you know, is like a mystery, a puzzle, something that's not obvious on the surface. You have to dig down below the surface to understand. The enigma begins with verse 1, where it says, now Satan stood up against Israel and Satan moved David to number Israel. You say, well, what makes that so enigmatic? I said there are two accounts to this story, the second account in 2 Kings 24. Let me read verse 1 of that. And that's describing this very same incident, this very same story. But it reads differently. Listen to this. In 2 Samuel 24 verse 1 it says, again, the anger of the Lord was aroused against Israel, and he moved David against them to say, go number Israel and Judah. So there's a seeming discrepancy there. According to 1 Chronicles 21, Satan stood up. That is, he assumed this hostile posture. He was ready to pounce upon Israel. And he enticed David. But 2 Samuel 24 focuses on the fact that the Lord was angry and that the Lord moved David. So, which is right? Both of them. Because both accounts are simply providing for us different details of the same incident. And that happens all the time. I mean, when there's a serious traffic accident and the police come, and one of those policemen may be a specialist, that is, he's an investigator to get all the details. So he will interview all the witnesses, and let's say there are 4 witnesses to the accident. And so he will get different details about the same event. Hopefully none of them conflicting, but one of the witnesses may say, well, you know what? When I heard the bang, I was looking at my clock, and it was exactly 4:10 12 in the afternoon, and no one else may have provided that information. And yet another witness can say, just when this occurred, it had just started raining, just like 2 minutes before. And another one might provide a different detail. Just as this was happening, the traffic was just horrific. I mean, people were speeding and racing, and it was just horrible. And another one might provide the apparent speed of one of the vehicles involved. He may have been following and said, yes, I looked at my speedometer just before the crash. I was going 34 miles an hour, and so was one of the cars involved. So they all provide different details, but they're not contradicting one another. They're just helping give the police officer the full picture. They're putting all the pieces together so he can see or she can see the full picture of exactly what happened, and that's very helpful. That's exactly what we see in 1 Chronicles 21 and 2 Samuel 24. And by the way, if you read the four Gospels, guess what? You read the same exact word in the four Gospels, the same exact stories and details of all the incidents surrounding Jesus Christ. No, you read different details. In fact, some of them include things that others don't, especially when you read the book of the Gospel of John. But they're all providing details of the same incidents, the same stories that help us to see a fuller and a more complete picture. Now, if we combine the details of 1 Chronicles 21 and 2 Samuel 24, we do see the picture more clearly. And I don't have much time, so I'll have to go quickly. All right, now in 1 Chronicles 21 states that Satan stood up and Satan moved David. That tells us that Satan was the immediate, the on-scene instigator of what is happening. And when 2 Samuel 24 states that the Lord was angry with Israel and that the Lord moved David, it just telling us that the Lord, God, Jehovah, was behind all of this. In other words, God permitted Satan to tempt David, and for good reason. Israel had yet again displayed disrespect for God in favoring the rule of others as opposed to God's appointed or anointed, which would be King David. In other words, when somebody else rose up and said, I think I can do a better job than King David, many of the people would flock to that person, and they did. But David was the anointed of God. They should have been loyal to God. So the nation needed a wake-up call. They needed a warning. And it came as a result of a temptation and a sin. But here's the thing, God can't tempt. God cannot tempt man to sin. And God can't be tempted himself, James 1:13. But he can motivate Satan to tempt. He can loosen the leash of Satan and allow him to tempt. And that's exactly what happened here. God permitted Satan to entice David into doing something that would bring serious consequences to the whole nation and hopefully teach the nation a lesson. And let me just stop my alarm there. All right, so let me finish this up as quickly as I can. The most important lesson to learn, especially as we just begin in verse 1, is that the devil can only do what God allows him to do. And I'll tell you what, that brings me comfort. I hope it brings you comfort too, because when things are going badly, and they are, in our world, in our country, here in the state of Michigan, you can be pretty confident Satan has a hand in all of this, but only because God allows him to do so. And God allows Satan to do so when God has a greater purpose in mind, something good. I mean, think about it. When Jesus was betrayed, who tempted Judas Iscariot? The devil, directly, yes. I mean, Jesus was arrested and tried and condemned and beaten and scourged and crucified. Who tempted these people to do what they did? The devil. But who allowed the devil to do that? Who is ultimately behind the betrayal, the arrest, the condemnation, the beating, the scourging, and the crucifixion of our Lord? God. Because God knew that was the only way you and I could one day be in heaven. Make no mistake about it. God is in control, not the devil. David once said, our God is in heaven. He does whatever he pleases. Psalms 115 and verse 3. Job, the one that God allowed the devil to do so much to, would later say, near the end of everything he went through in Job 42 verse 2. He said about God, he said, I know that you can do everything, and no purpose of yours can be withheld from you. And one of the most fascinating statements by a man who is relatively wicked, King Nebuchadnezzar, is found in Daniel 4:35. When God taught him, and he came to his right mind, literally, he said this about God. He said, He does according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. No one can restrain his hand or say to him, what have you done? God is in control. Stay tuned for lesson 2 on David's plague. Thank you so much for watching, and may God bless you and yours.